The dust on Maude Harper's boots told the whole story of the last 2 weeks, 5 layers of it, each one from a different ranch, each one a different shade of humiliation. She had left Abilene, Kansas on the 14th of September, 1873, with nothing more than a carpetbag, a small coin purse containing $11.40, and the kind of quiet desperation that a woman learns to carry like a second skin when the world keeps closing its doors in her face. The carpetbag held a change of dress, a wool blanket that had belonged to her mother, a battered copy of the King James Bible with her parents' names pressed inside the front cover, and a folded letter she had not read since the morning she buried her husband, Thomas Harper, in the rocky soil behind the house they had rented together in Abilene. Thomas had died of cholera in August, quick and terrible the way cholera always was, leaving Maude at 26 years old with no children, no land of her own, no family within 300 miles, and a landlord who had given her exactly 12 days to vacate the premises before he rented it to someone else. The landlord, a thick-necked man named Orville Pratt, had said it with the kind of practiced sympathy that was really just business wearing a Sunday coat. He had tipped his hat, said he was sorry for her loss, and then told her she owed him for the final month regardless. She had paid it. She had paid it because Thomas had always taught her to settle her debts and hold her head up, and even in her grief she had found herself following the shape of the man he had been, the way water follows a riverbed long after the rain has stopped. From Abilene, she had heard through the women at the dry goods store that there were ranches to the south and west that sometimes took on hired help, women who could cook and sew and manage a household in exchange for room and board and a small wage. It was not a glamorous life, but glamour had never been something Maude had known very much of, and a roof and honest work were enough for her to aim at. The first ranch had been the Caldwell Spread, about 18 miles southwest of Abilene. She had walked most of the way, caught a ride on a wagon for the last 4 miles, and arrived at midday with her carpetbag in hand, and her dark hair pinned back as neatly as the wind would allow. Mrs. Caldwell had opened the door, looked Maude up and down, and said that she already had all the help she needed, and that she should try the Hennessy Ranch to the west. There had been no unkindness in it particularly, just a door shutting with a quiet finality that Maude had already begun to recognize. The Hennessy Ranch had been 3 hours further, and the man who answered the door, a red-faced fellow with suspicious eyes, had looked at Maude and said he did not take on women workers without a husband present to vouch for them. He had said it like a policy, like a rule written down somewhere, and when Maude had explained that her husband had recently passed and that she was a decent, hard-working woman who asked only for honest employment, he had said he was sorry but rules were rules, and he shut the door. The third ranch had been the Beaumont place, where she had been told by a bored-looking young cowhand to wait on the porch while he fetched the boss. She had waited for 30 minutes in the afternoon heat before the boss appeared, a tall, angular man named Beaumont who looked at her bag and then at her, and said the position had been filled just that morning. Whether it was true or not, Maude could not say. What she could say was that she had sat down on the edge of the porch steps after he went back inside, and she had allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of quiet crying before she wiped her face, stood up, and kept walking. The fourth ranch had belonged to a family named Dillard. They had been kind, kinder than the others, and Mrs. Dillard had given her a cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread, and listened to her whole story with genuine sympathy before explaining that they simply could not afford extra wages this season, that the drought had been hard, and they were already stretching what they had between the family and 2 permanent hands. She had sent Maude off with a wrapped parcel of cornbread and directions to the McIntosh Ranch, which was another 7 miles north. The McIntosh Ranch had been the worst of all, not for anything violent or dramatically cruel, but for the manner of it. Mr. McIntosh had opened his door, heard 2 sentences of Maude's explanation, and then called past her shoulder to his wife and said, in a voice loud enough that his 2 young sons playing in the yard could hear, that another one of those wandering women was at the door looking for charity. He had used the word charity like it was something shameful on her part, like asking for work was the same as begging, and Maude had drawn herself up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and she had said quite clearly that she was looking for employment, not charity, that she was a capable woman with good references, and that she thanked him for his time. She had turned and walked away with her back straight and her chin level, and she had not looked back once. That had been yesterday. Yesterday evening, she had slept under a cottonwood tree near a shallow creek, wrapped in her mother's blanket, listening to the coyotes call across the dark prairie, and trying to hold on to something like hope. The night had been clear, and the stars had been the brilliant, overwhelming kind that only appear when you are very far from everything familiar, and she had looked at them for a long time before sleep finally took her. This morning she had risen with the sun, washed her face in the creek, combed her hair with her fingers, and set off again. Her feet hurt inside her boots. Her stomach was empty except for the last heel of the cornbread Mrs. Dillard had given her. The $11.40 was still in her coin purse, barely touched because she had found no town close enough to spend it at, and she was being careful with it anyway, because it was all she had in the world and it needed to last. She did not know exactly how far she had walked that morning when she first saw the fence line. It was good fencing, tighter and better maintained than the fencing of the ranches she had passed, with cedar posts set deep and straight and wire strung evenly between them. Beyond the fence she could see a pasture of dry grass, where a small herd of longhorn cattle were grazing with the slow, unhurried dignity that cattle have, and past that a barn painted red that was fading to rust in the sun, and past that a low, wide ranch house with a covered porch running along the front of it. There was no sign on the gate, nothing to tell her whose place this was or whether she would find welcome or another closed door. But there was a well near the barn that she could see from the road, and she was thirsty enough that she would have knocked on the door of the devil himself for a cup of water. She found the gate, lifted the latch the way she had learned to lift latches at all the others, and walked up the long dirt path toward the house. The man was on the porch before she got there. He had appeared from around the side of the house, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder and a saddle blanket over the other, and he stopped when he saw her coming up the path. He was tall, lean in the particular way that men who do hard outdoor work become lean, with wide shoulders that had been shaped by years of lifting and hauling and wrestling the land into something useful. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where his hat did not cover it, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, and eyes that she could not yet see clearly enough to name a color for. He looked to be somewhere around 30, maybe a year or 2 either side. He did not say anything as she walked up, but he watched her with an attention that was neither hostile nor intrusive. He was simply a man looking at something unexpected and taking stock of it before he spoke. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. He was looking back at her with those eyes which turned out to be a dark sort of brown, the color of creek water in the shade, and they had lines at the corners from sun and from something else that she could not yet identify. "Good morning," Maude said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady through practice by this point, through 5 versions of this same moment, and she knew how to begin. "Morning," the man said. He set the saddle blanket down on the porch rail but kept the rope over his shoulder, which told her he was not planning to be stopped for long. "You all right, ma'am?" "I am," she said, because she had decided that was always the right answer. "My name is Maude Harper and I have come from Abilene. My husband passed 6 weeks ago and I am looking for work. I can cook, I can sew, I can keep a house and a yard, I know the basics of doctoring for both people and livestock. I am not afraid of hard work, and I am not in the habit of complaining about it. I am asking for employment, not charity, and I can provide references if given the means to send for them." She delivered it the way she had delivered it 4 times before, clear and honest and without apology, because she had decided somewhere between the Hennessy Ranch and the Beaumont place that apologizing for your own existence was a habit you had to be careful not to let take root. The man on the porch was quiet for a moment. He looked at her carpetbag, then at her boots, then back at her face. There was something in his expression that she could not quite read, something that was not pity exactly, but was aware of what she had been through in a way that surprised her. "How long have you been walking?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. None of the others had asked her that. "2 weeks, more or less," she said, "though I had a wagon ride for part of it." He was quiet again for a moment longer, and Maude braced herself. She had become very good at bracing herself. She had the posture of a woman who was ready to hear no and had made a private agreement with herself to bear it without flinching. "You can stay here as long as you need," the man said. Maude blinked. She was not certain for a moment that she had heard correctly. "My name is Jedediah Yates," the man continued, and he set the rope down on the porch beside the saddle blanket and came down the 2 porch steps to stand at ground level with her, which seemed to her to be a deliberate thing, a decision not to talk down to her from the height of the steps. "I've got a ranch house with a spare room and enough work to keep 2 people busy from sunup to sundown. I've been running this place alone since my foreman left for Colorado in the spring. I can't promise you a fortune in wages, but I can promise you a fair wage, a roof, 3 meals a day, and that nobody here will make you feel like you're less than what you are." Maude looked at him for a long moment. Her throat had gone unexpectedly tight, and she swallowed against it carefully, because she had cried on the Beaumont porch and she had cried under the cottonwood tree by the creek, and she did not intend to cry in front of a stranger who had just been kind to her, because kindness, when it finally arrived, was somehow the most dangerous thing for the composure. "That is a fair offer," she said, and her voice only wavered the very smallest amount. "I accept it." Jedediah Yates nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing has been settled, and then he picked up his rope and his saddle blanket and said, "I'll show you to the house. There's water in the kitchen, hot if you need it, and I think there's cornbread left from last night." "I would be very grateful for the water," Maude said, and just like that she walked through the door. The inside of the Yates ranch house was spare but clean. It had the kind of cleanliness that comes not from elegance but from habit, from a man who had been raised to put things back where they belonged and to sweep a floor because a floor needed sweeping. There was a stone fireplace at one end of the main room, cold now in the early autumn warmth, with a plain wooden mantelpiece above it on which sat a clock, a tin cup, and a small framed photograph that Maude did not look at long enough to identify the subject. There was a table with 4 chairs, a cookstove against the far wall with a woodpile beside it that was well stocked, and 2 windows that faced south and let in a good amount of morning light. Jedediah showed her the spare room, which was off the kitchen. It was small but had a bed with a cornhusk mattress and a proper pillow, a wooden washstand with a basin and pitcher, a hook on the wall for hanging clothes, and a window that faced east. It was more than she had had under the cottonwood tree. It was more than she deserved, she thought, and then she caught herself thinking that and pushed back against it, because Thomas had always said that deserving was not the word you used about basic human kindness. Basic human kindness was not something you earned. It was something that ought to be given freely, and the tragedy of the world was only that it so often was not. She left her carpetbag in the room and went to the kitchen, where Jedediah had put a kettle on and cut 2 pieces from what remained of a pan of cornbread. He set them on the table without ceremony and poured water from a tin pitcher into a cup and put it in front of her, and then sat down across the table with his own cup of water and looked at her with those creek-colored eyes. "You said you came from Abilene," he said. "Yes. My husband and I went there 4 years ago. He worked for the cattle buyers. When he died, the house went with the job and there was nothing else for me there. No family. My parents are both gone. I have a brother in Missouri, but he has a wife and 4 children and a small farm and cannot take another mouth. I wrote to him before I left. He wrote back that he was sorry and that he wished things were different." She paused. "I don't hold it against him. Times are hard." Jedediah was quiet for a moment, turning his water cup in his hands the way some men do with a coffee cup when they are thinking. "Times are hard," he agreed. There was something behind the words, a weight to them that made her look at him more carefully. "What about you?" she asked, and then immediately wondered if it was forward to ask, if she was overstepping already on her first hour in the man's house. "I apologize, you do not have to answer that." "No, it's all right," he said. "I don't have family close either. My father died when I was 22. My mother lives in Missouri, coincidentally enough, a town called Warrensburg. She's healthy and she writes when she can, but Missouri might as well be the moon for how often I get up there." He paused. "My wife died 3 years ago, fever." "I am sorry," Maude said, and she meant it fully. "Thank you," he said, and he meant that too. They were quiet for a moment with the weight of their respective losses, which were different in shape but not entirely different in feeling. The way two rivers cut by different storms can still run the same color. Then Jedediah straightened up and said, "I've got fence to mend on the south pasture today. If you want to rest, you should rest. If you'd rather have something to do with your hands, the kitchen garden needs attention and there's mending in the basket by the fireplace. Do whatever suits you. Supper I usually manage myself around sundown, but if you want to take it over, I won't object." "I will take it over," Maude said immediately, because cooking was the thing she could offer right now, the most immediate and tangible way to be useful, and she needed to be useful. She needed it the way some people need sleep. Jedediah nodded, put on his hat, which he had left on the table when he came in, and went out the back door, and she listened to the sound of his boots on the hard ground until they faded. And then she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the sun coming through the south window and the smell of the dry prairie coming in under the door, and she thought, for the first time in 6 weeks, that maybe she was going to be all right. She spent that afternoon learning the kitchen. She found the pantry stocked with basics: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, lard, sugar, coffee beans, a string of dried chilies hanging from a hook, a crock of molasses, jars of canned tomatoes that someone had put up, she guessed, the previous year. She found the root cellar under the kitchen floor, accessed by a trapdoor, where there were stored potatoes and onions and a few winter squash. She found the henhouse out back, where 6 hens were willing to give up their eggs when asked properly. She made a supper of salt pork and beans seasoned with the dried chili, cornbread with molasses, and a pot of the strong black coffee that she found in a tin on the shelf above the stove. It was plain food, but good food, the kind that fills a working man up and keeps him going. And when Jedediah came in at sundown with the smell of the pasture and the horses on him, dusty and tired, and sat down at the table and looked at what she had made, he said, "This is better than what I've been eating," with a directness that she appreciated more than any elaborate compliment. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it," he said, and helped himself to a generous portion of the beans, and they ate together across the table with the lamp burning between them and the night settling down over the prairie outside the windows, and it was quiet but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes between two people who have both been alone for a while and have not quite forgotten how to be in company. After supper she washed the dishes and he dried them, which she had not expected of him, and he told her about the fence work, that 3 posts had needed replacing and there was a section of wire that had been cut, probably by rustlers moving stock across the corner of the property. Nothing taken as far as he could tell, but something to watch. "You have trouble with rustlers often?" she asked. "More than I'd like," he said. "Less than some ranches. I don't run a big enough herd to be worth the serious trouble, but there are men in this territory who will take what they can get. Is there a lawman nearby? Sheriff in Caldwell, which is about 12 miles north, Bill Lawson. He's a decent man, but he has a lot of ground to cover and not enough deputies. Mostly we look out for our own out here." She nodded, filing this away. 12 miles to town, 6 hens in the back, salt pork and beans, and a root cellar full of onions. A man who dried dishes and did not think her forward for asking about his life. These were the coordinates of her new existence, and she began to arrange them in her mind with the careful practicality that had always been her greatest strength. Over the next several days, she found her rhythm. She rose before sunrise because she always had, and she made coffee and started on whatever there was to be done in the kitchen, while the sky went through its elaborate performance of turning from black to blue to gold. She tended the kitchen garden, which was in better shape than Jedediah had suggested, the beds of late turnips and beets, and dried onion tops just needing clearing and some attention to the soil. She mended 3 shirts and a pair of trousers from the basket by the fireplace, and discovered in the process that Jedediah was harder on his clothes than most men, not from carelessness, but from the sheer physicality of the work he did. She met his horse, a big roan gelding named Carpenter, on the second day. The horse was kept in a well-made stall in the barn along with a second horse, a smaller bay mare named Delilah, who was, Jedediah told her, the gentlest animal he had ever owned and good for anyone to ride. "Can you ride?" he asked as he showed her the barn. "Tolerably," she said. "I learned as a girl. I have not had much occasion since." "Delilah will take care of you," he said, and the way he said it was simple and without condescension, just the honest assessment of a horseman about his horse. On the third day he took her into Caldwell in the wagon for supplies. She sat beside him on the wagon seat with the flat prairie opening out around them, and the October sky enormous overhead and the smell of dust and dry grass in the air, and she watched the land the way she had been watching it all these weeks, trying to understand it, because it was so different from the Missouri of her childhood, so much wider and emptier and more demanding in its beauty. "It gets to you," Jedediah said, following her gaze out over the prairie. "It does," she agreed. "I'm not sure if I love it yet or only respect it. That's pretty much how it always starts," he said. "The love comes later." She glanced at him, and he was looking at the road ahead, not at her, his hat pulled down slightly against the wind, and she did not read anything particular into what he had said, but she kept it tucked somewhere in the back of her mind nonetheless. Caldwell was a small, busy town with a main street of wooden buildings, a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, a church, and a small building that served as both the sheriff's office and the jail. There were cattle pens at the north end of town that smelled powerfully in the dry wind, and a stockyard where buyers came to deal with the ranchers who drove their herds up from the south. It was not a pretty town, but it was alive in the particular way that working towns are alive, full of purpose and noise, and the constant commerce of people getting things done. Jedediah introduced her to the proprietor of the general store, a round-faced man named Elias Thorne, and his wife, Clara, who was Maude's age with freckles and a quick laugh, and who took to Maude with an immediate warmth that was almost startling after the cool indifference of the previous 2 weeks. "We heard Jed had finally taken on some help," Clara said, and she said it with a particular brightness that made her husband look at her with the expression of a man who knows his wife is about to say something that will embarrass the people present. "We are very glad to hear it. He has been out there alone too long. A person needs company." "I am glad for the work," Maude said, carefully neutral. "Of course you are," Clara said, with the same brightness, and moved on to asking her about what she needed from the store. On the ride back, with the wagon loaded with flour, coffee, sugar, dried beans, a new bolt of plain cotton fabric, 2 tins of lard, salt, and a jar of pepper, Maude turned to Jedediah and said, "Mrs. Thorne is a very warm person." "She is," Jedediah said, and there was a note of something in his voice, a slight elevation at the corner of his mouth. "She is also the most dedicated matchmaker in Caldwell County, so I would take some of her warmth as being aimed at a particular end." Maude laughed. It was the first real laugh she had produced in 6 weeks, and it came out somewhat rusty, like a door hinge that has been unused but is still functional, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both of them a little. "I will consider myself warned," she said. "I am not warning you against her," he said, still with that small curl at the corner of his mouth that she was beginning to identify as the thing his face did when he was amused. "Only explaining the context." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and the prairie rolled out around them, and the afternoon light turned everything the color of old gold, and Maude thought that she had been in worse places than this wagon seat, going back to this ranch, sitting beside this particular man. She thought it, and then she was careful with the thought, because she was a practical woman and she had known this man for less than a week, and she had come here for employment and not for anything else. And besides which she was still carrying Thomas in the pocket of her ribs where she had put him the morning they buried him, and that was not a weight you simply set down. But the thought was there, and it stayed there, quiet and patient, the way true things sometimes do. She had been at the Yates ranch for 3 weeks when the trouble came. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback who appeared at the gate in the early morning while Jedediah was out with Carpenter checking the northern fence line. Maude was in the kitchen garden when she heard them at the gate, and she straightened up and looked across the yard at them. They were not the kind of men who put you at ease. They were rough-looking, dressed in a way that suggested they spent more time riding than working, with the particular lean hunger about them that she had learned to recognize in certain men who had decided that the world owed them something and were prepared to collect it by unconventional means. The older of the two, a man with a red kerchief and a long jaw, called out across the yard, "Is Yates here?" "He is out on the property," Maude said, walking toward the gate but stopping a good distance from it. "What is your business?" "Our business is with Yates," the man said. "We'll wait." "I would rather you came back another time," Maude said. The man looked at her with flat eyes and a smile that did not involve any warmth. "I would rather not," he said. "We'll wait." She went inside and got the shotgun from the cabinet where Jedediah kept it, loaded it the way she had seen Thomas load a similar one, and the way she had practiced twice since coming to the ranch, because this was the kind of country where a woman alone in a house needed to know how to do that. And she stood in the doorway and was visible to them without being close to them. And she did not point the gun at anyone, only held it, and the 2 men looked at her and seemed to recalibrate. They waited near the gate for about 40 minutes, which was an uncomfortable 40 minutes for everyone involved, and then Jedediah came back and rode up to the gate and she watched from the doorway as he spoke with them. The conversation was not long. The men left. Jedediah came up to the porch with the particular tightness in his jaw that she had come to recognize as his form of controlled anger. "Who were they?" she asked. "Brothers named Cole and Dean Harwick," he said. "They run cattle through the territory and they have been trying to buy this land for 2 years. I have told them no twice. That was the 3rd time. They want your land. There is water on this land," he said simply. "The creek runs through the south pasture. In this drought that is worth a great deal. And they will not take no for an answer. Apparently not." He looked at the shotgun in her hands. "Thank you for being sensible. Thank you for not being angry about it." He gave her a look that said that idea had not even occurred to him. "Why would I be angry about that?" She did not answer, but she put the gun back in the cabinet and thought about the 3 or 4 reasons a different kind of man might have offered, and she felt, with some private relief, that Jedediah Yates was not that kind of man. That evening after supper, sitting at the table with the lamp burning and the last of the October warmth still in the air through the open window, he told her more about the Harwick brothers, how they had been moving through the county for the past 3 years, acquiring land through pressure, and occasionally through means that Sheriff Lawson suspected were not entirely legal but could not prove. How 2 small farmers to the south had sold to them under what everyone believed were circumstances not entirely of their own free choosing. How the brothers had the rough backing of a cattle buyer in Wichita who had money enough to make trouble and wanted a corridor of land and water from the Kansas border south through Indian Territory. "Have you spoken to Sheriff Lawson?" Maude asked. "I have. He is aware of them. He has told me to document any interactions, keep a record of when they come and what they say, so that if it escalates there is a paper trail." He paused. "I am not planning to sell. This land was my father's before it was mine, and I put 7 years of my own work into it, and I have no intention of handing it over to men like the Harwick brothers." There was a firmness in his voice that she recognized as the kind that did not come from stubbornness, but from genuine conviction, the voice of a man who had decided where he stood and had no reason to move. "Good," she said, and meant it. He looked at her across the table, and for a moment the lamplight was between them, and there was something in his expression, a kind of recognition, as though he had expected her to say something else and was pleasantly surprised by what she had actually said. "Good," he repeated. "This is good land," she said. "Anyone who can look at that pasture and that creek and those hills to the west and not understand why it's worth keeping is not someone worth losing it to." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she might have overstepped, might have intruded into something that was not her business to have opinions about. But then he said, "No, they're not," and there was something in his voice that had shifted, something slightly softer, though she might have imagined it. November came in cold and fast, the way it does on the Kansas prairie, with a north wind that came down from nowhere and turned the grass brown overnight and coated the water trough with a skim of ice each morning. Maude unpacked her mother's wool blanket and the heavier dress she had saved for winter, and she set about preparing the house for the cold with the same methodical energy she brought to everything. She caulked the windows with rags, stacked additional firewood on the porch within easy reach, made sure the henhouse had enough bedding, and began cooking the heavier soups and stews that cold weather demanded. She and Jedediah had settled into a routine that had the comfortable, unspoken quality of two people who have begun to understand each other's rhythms. He rose early, and she rose earlier. He came in for meals at regular times, and she had them ready. He did not require a great deal of conversation in the mornings, but opened up considerably in the evenings when the work was done and they sat at the table or by the fireplace with their coffee. And she had discovered that he was a reader, that he had a shelf of books in his bedroom that she had glimpsed through the open door, and that he had opinions about what he read, opinions that were interesting and sometimes surprising. He was reading a history of the Comanche people that he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita, and he had offered to lend it to her when he finished, and she had accepted, and they had fallen into the habit of discussing whatever she was reading, and whatever he was reading in a way that had started to feel like the most natural thing in the world. She was reading the Bible, as she always did, and she had also borrowed a volume of Mrs. Browning's poetry from his shelf and was working through it in the evenings, and he had asked her one evening what she thought of it, and she had said that she found it remarkable how much truth could be carried in such a compact form, and he had said that he agreed, and then he had recited from memory a verse from one of the sonnets, quietly and without performance, just as something he knew. And she had looked at him over the top of the book and thought that there was more to Jedediah Yates than the fencing and the cattle and the careful management of the land. One evening in mid-November, they had their first real disagreement. It was not a large one, but it had the heat of something genuine in it. She had come in from the barn where she had been tending Delilah, who had a slight lameness in her right foreleg that Maude had been treating with warm compresses, and she had found Jedediah at the table writing a letter. He had been writing it with a concentration that suggested it was important, and she had not interrupted, but when he finished and set down the pen she had asked, without really thinking, who he was writing to. He had said it was a letter to a lawyer in Wichita, informing the lawyer that he had engaged a woman as a housekeeper, and that he wanted to ensure the arrangement was properly documented, wages and terms, because he believed that clear agreements prevented misunderstandings. Maude had said that she appreciated the thoughtfulness of that, but she had then asked whether the lawyer had been consulted before she arrived, and he had said no, that he had been meaning to do it for 2 weeks. And she had said, more sharply than she intended, that she hoped the letter was not being written because someone in town had made a remark about the impropriety of a woman living alone on a ranch with an unmarried man, because if it was, she would prefer to know it directly. There had been a moment of silence, And then Jedediah had put the pen down very deliberately and looked at her and said, "No one in town has said anything to me about it. And if they had, I would have told them that it is none of their business. The letter is being written because you are an employee, and you deserve to have your wages and terms protected in writing, and I should have done it the day you arrived. I am sorry I did not do it sooner." Maude had looked at him for a long moment, and she had felt the sharpness go out of her like heat from a room when a window is opened, and she had said, "I apologize for the tone of what I said." "You have every right to ask direct questions," he said, and he said it simply and without residue. After that, the evenings at the table had a slightly different quality, a slight elevation in the ease between them. The way disagreements honestly resolved sometimes leave things more settled than they were before. In December, Clara Thorne came to visit, arriving in a buggy with her husband Elias and a basket containing 2 jars of apple butter, a round of cheese, and a fruitcake. She came ostensibly to bring Christmas cheer, but primarily, Maude suspected, to satisfy her own curiosity about the domestic situation at the Yates ranch. Clara was the kind of woman who collected information not from malice but from genuine fascination with the lives of the people around her, and she went about her collecting with such open good humor that it was impossible to hold it against her. Elias was quieter than his wife, a solid, amiable man who talked with Jedediah about cattle prices and the weather and the state of the roads, while Clara sat with Maude in the kitchen and asked her everything about Abilene and Thomas and her family, and what she thought of Kansas, and whether she had ever seen the mountains, and whether she found the winters very long. "And how do you find living out here?" Clara asked at the end of a long series of more innocuous questions, with a directness that the previous questions had been building toward. "I find it good," Maude said. "And how do you find Jedediah?" "I find him to be an honest and fair employer," Maude said. Clara looked at her with eyes that said she had heard the careful navigation in that answer and found it interesting. "He is a good man," Clara said. "He was very low after his wife passed. He withdrew for a long time. It is good to see him, I think, more himself." She paused. "He talks more than he used to." "Does he?" Maude said. "Considerably," said Clara and smiled, and took a piece of fruitcake, and said nothing further on the subject but let the silence do the work for her, which was a skill that Maude had to privately admire. After the Thornes left and the house was quiet again, Jedediah came into the kitchen where she was putting away the apple butter jars, and he said without preamble, "Clara asked you things, I imagine." "She did," Maude said. "She asks everyone things," he said. "You do not have to tell me what she asked or what you answered." "She asked how I find you," Maude said, because she found she wanted to say it and she was not certain exactly why. He turned slightly toward her. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were an honest and fair employer," Maude said, a small pause. "Is that all you think of me?" The question came out quietly, and she looked up from the shelf where she was placing the jars and found him watching her with those cream-colored eyes. And there was something in the question that was entirely genuine, not coy or calculated. Just a man asking something that mattered to him, with the particular bravery of asking it directly and leaving himself open to whatever the honest answer was. "No," she said, equally quietly. "That is not all." The pause that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that happens when 2 people have said a true thing and are both sitting with it, not rushing past it. "Good," he said, in the same tone he had used the night she had said the land was worth keeping, and she thought that word between them had begun to carry more weight than its single syllable suggested. Christmas at the ranch was quiet and good. She made a roast chicken with the fattest hen from the back, which she had been fattening for weeks, and a dried apple pie with the apples from a sack Jedediah had brought back from Caldwell, and a pudding with the molasses and the raisins she had put by. They ate at the table with 2 candles burning, and she had put a sprig of dried prairie grass in a tin cup, because it was all she had in the way of decoration, and it struck her as both humble and honest, and those were the qualities she aspired to. After supper, Jedediah went to the shelf in the main room and brought back a small wrapped parcel and set it on the table beside her plate without ceremony. She looked at it and then at him. "It is Christmas," he said, which was explanation enough. She opened it carefully and found a small book, dark green cloth cover, with the title pressed in gilt letters. It was a collection of American poetry, Longfellow and Whittier and Emerson and others, and inside the front cover in his plain, even handwriting he had written for Maude with the date. She held it for a moment and felt the weight of the kindness of it, the thought that had gone into choosing it for her specifically, and she said, "Thank you, Jedediah. This is a very fine gift." "I noticed you were partial to the poetry," he said. She had made him a pair of gloves from the wool she had bought in Caldwell, knitted in the evenings when the light was low, and her eyes did not want to read any more. They were dark gray, heavy and well-made, and she had put considerable care into the knitting of them because she knew what his hands endured every day and she wanted them warm. He put them on at the table, right there, which she had not expected, and looked at them on his hands and said, "These are the finest gloves I have ever owned," and looked up at her with an expression that made her chest feel full in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. January was hard. The January of 1874 on the Kansas prairie was not a January that was kind to anyone. The blizzards came down from the north with a viciousness that turned the world white and blinding for days at a time, and the temperature dropped so low that the creek in the south pasture froze solid, and the water in the kitchen water barrel had a skim of ice on it each morning despite the fire. The cattle were kept in the lower pasture closest to the barn and fed hay from the supply they had laid in during the fall, and Maude and Jedediah fell into a shared exhaustion that was the exhaustion of two people fighting the same large enemy. She helped with the livestock on the bad days, because there was simply too much to be done for one person alone, and she would not stay inside and be warm while he was out in the wind. He tried to tell her to stay in on the first of the bad days, and she had looked at him with a patience that communicated her position clearly, and he had handed her his second heaviest coat and a pair of canvas gloves and said, "All right, the far stock tank needs breaking." They worked beside each other through the worst of it, breaking ice from the water troughs with a long-handled iron bar, carrying extra hay out to the cattle in the deep snow, checking on the horses, making sure the henhouse stayed above freezing with extra straw. Their breath made clouds and the snow was boot-deep and the wind found every gap in their clothing. And in the evenings they came in half-frozen and stood by the fireplace and warmed up slowly with coffee in their hands. And there was something in those hours, cold and tired and alive in the big warmth of the fire, that had a quality she would have had trouble describing to someone who had not been there. A quality of absolute honesty, of two people stripped down to exactly what they were by the cold and the work and the dependence on each other. One evening in the middle of a particularly bad week of weather, when they had been working outside most of the day and had come in well after dark, and she had made a simple supper of potato soup because it was what was fastest, they were sitting at the table with their soup and the fire going hard behind them, and Jedediah set his spoon down and looked at her across the table. "Maude," he said. She looked up. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, and I want you to know that I am not saying it to pressure you in any direction, and that whatever you say in response, nothing changes about the arrangement here. Your room and your wages and your work are all secure regardless." She put her own spoon down and gave him her full attention. "I have come to feel," he said, and there was a careful deliberateness to the words, the deliberateness of a man who has thought about what he is going to say, and has decided that the only respectful thing is to say it directly, considerably more than an employer's regard for you. "I am aware that you have been through a great deal, and that you have not been here very long, and that you came here for work, and not for anything else. I am not asking you to feel anything in particular in return. I am simply telling you where I stand because I believe that honesty between people matters more than comfort." The fire was very loud in the silence after he stopped speaking. The wind was at the windows and the snow was ticking against the glass, and the lamp was burning between them, and she looked at him across all of it, at his serious face and his careful eyes and the gray wool gloves hanging on the hook by the door. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time." "That is not an answer," he said, with a slight catch in his voice that suggested he was more anxious than he was letting show. "No," she agreed. "It is context." She took a breath. "What I feel for you is not simple yet, and I am not certain I have the right to give it a name. But I feel it, and I want you to know that I do." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes, and then he nodded, and the tension in his shoulders eased in a way that was visible even from across the table, and he picked up his soup spoon and said, "That is enough for now." And she heard in those 4 words a patience that was so genuine it made her want to say more, but she also heard that he meant them, that he was not saying them to hurry her, that he actually meant them. "Jedediah," she said. He looked up. "Thank you for saying it plainly." "Thank you for hearing it that way," he said. February brought a slight warming, and with it the return of the Harwick brothers, not to the ranch this time, but in an indirect way. Jedediah came back from a trip to Caldwell for supplies with a tight expression, and told her that he had heard from Sheriff Lawson that Cole Harwick had been making noises in town about the Yates property. Specifically, that he had been telling people that the ranch had significant title issues and might not have been legally transferred from Jedediah's father in the original deed. It was, Lawson had told him, almost certainly a pressure tactic, the kind designed to make a man nervous about the security of what he had and more likely to sell before some imagined legal trouble arrived. "Is there any truth to it?" Maude asked because she was a practical woman and she always asked the question that was hardest first. "None that I know of," Jedediah said. "My father filed the deed proper in 1864 when he settled this land. I have the papers." "Then you need to show them to a lawyer," she said. "Not because you are worried, but because having a lawyer confirm it in writing closes the door they are trying to open." He looked at her. "That is exactly what Lawson said." "Sheriff Lawson is a sensible man," she said. "He went to Wichita the following week to see the lawyer, and she managed the ranch alone for 4 days, which she did with the competence she had been building since September. And when he came back with a letter from the lawyer attesting to the clear title of the land and the proper transfer of the deed, she made a celebratory supper of roast pork and sweet potato and a pie. And they ate it with a satisfaction that was partly about the food and partly about the door that had been firmly closed against the Harwick brothers. After supper, with the table cleared and the fire burning low and the February wind quiet for once outside, Jedediah said, "While I was in Wichita, I visited a jeweler." She was at the fireplace banking the coals and she went still. "I did not buy anything," he said. "I looked. I walked past the window and I looked in." She turned from the fireplace and looked at him, and he was standing near the table, not quite meeting her eyes with his usual directness, and she thought that this was what Jedediah Yates looked like when he was not entirely certain of himself, and it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen. "What were you looking at?" she asked. "You know what I was looking at," he said, and his voice was quiet and entirely honest. She crossed the room to stand a few feet from him, and they were close enough now that she could see every detail of his face, the cut of his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the mouth that so rarely smiled but when it did made the whole room brighter, and she understood that she had known for some time what she was going to say and had been waiting only for the right moment and the right words, and now both had arrived and there was nothing left to wait for. "Jedediah," she said. "Maude," he said, with a quality of attention so complete that it was almost like being held without being touched. "I am done needing time," she said. "If you want to go back to that jeweler, I would like you to go back to that jeweler." The silence lasted only a moment before his whole face changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a theatrical performance, but in the way of something genuinely moved, a warmth rising through the careful steadiness he kept himself in, and he said, Then I will go back." And he took her hand in both of his, the hand she had made the gray gloves for, and he held it carefully, and she thought that there was no quality she would trade in a person for the quality of being held carefully. They went to Caldwell 3 weeks later, on the last day of February, and were married by the minister of the small church at the south end of Main Street, with Elias and Clara Thorne as witnesses. Clara cried throughout, and Elias patted her arm with the practiced patience of a man long accustomed to his wife's emotional range. Sheriff Lawson, who had come in to sign some papers and happened to be present, shook Jedediah's hand with a warmth that said he was genuinely glad. Maude wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was navy blue wool, and she had put a spray of dried autumn grass in her hair for want of flowers, and Jedediah wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and had shaved that morning for the first time in several days, and they stood before the minister, and said the words to each other with the directness that was characteristic of both of them, clearly and without wavering. When the minister pronounced them married and Jedediah kissed her for the first time, it was brief and honest and tasted like coffee and cold February air, and she thought that she would not trade that kiss for any more elaborate or romantic one in any story she had ever read. Clara made them a small celebration supper at the Thorne house that evening, with a proper roast and a cake that she had apparently been planning for 2 weeks, which meant she had known the outcome before either of the principals did, or at least had prepared for it with characteristic confidence. The evening was warm and full of laughter, and the kind of ease that comes from being in the company of people who genuinely wish you well. And when Maude and Jedediah drove back to the ranch in the wagon under a sky full of February stars, she sat close beside him on the wagon seat, and he kept one hand on the reins and one arm around her shoulder, and she thought about the September morning 2.5 months ago, when she had walked up the path to this man's house with her carpetbag and her dust-covered boots and her carefully held composure, and she thought about how strange and good and entirely unexpected the shape of life could be. Spring came to the ranch like an apology for winter, soft and green and gradual, the grass coming back in the south pasture along the creek and the kitchen garden coming up in orderly rows, and the hens laying more enthusiastically, and the light coming back later and later each evening, until the evenings were long and golden, and there was birdsong in the cottonwoods along the creek bank. Maude planted the kitchen garden herself with seeds she had ordered from Caldwell, expanding the beds to include tomatoes and squash and sweet corn and dried beans, and Jedediah built her a second raised bed along the south wall of the house where she grew herbs, thyme and sage and sweet basil, and the smell of the sage on a warm afternoon was one of the specific small joys that she collected against the difficult days. They acquired 2 more cows in the spring, bringing the dairy herd to 3, which was enough to keep them in butter and milk and cheese with some surplus to trade or sell. Maude took on the dairy work entirely, finding in the routine of milking and churning a meditative satisfaction that she had not anticipated. She liked the early morning quiet of the barn, the steam rising from the milk in the cool air, the contented sound of the cows, Delilah watching from her stall with the patient brown eyes that Jedediah had promised were kind. She began to know the land the way you know a person you have decided to stay with, by its moods and its seasons and its particular demands, the way the north pasture flooded in spring and needed a drainage channel that Jedediah had been planning, and she helped him dig it, the way the well water tasted faintly of iron in the dry months and clean and sweet after rain, the way the light on the western hills in the evening turned from gold to orange to something like rose before the dark came. And she thought that she understood now what he had meant in October when he said that the love comes later. In June, she told him that she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, the way she told him most things, directly and without preamble. She said, "I believe I am expecting," and watched his face. His face did what it had done on the evening in February when she told him to go back to the jeweler, that same movement of warmth through the steadiness, but larger this time, considerably larger, and he stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in both his hands, gently, as though she were something precious that he had not expected to be given and was still not quite accustomed to the fact of having. And he said, "Maude," in a voice that was not quite steady. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" "Very well." He held her for a long moment in the middle of the kitchen with the morning light coming through the south window, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek through his shirt, and she thought about Thomas and about the baby they had hoped for and never had, and she let herself feel that grief quietly and completely for a moment, and then she let it pass, because grief does not require you to choose between the love that was and the love that is, and she had learned that only slowly, but she had learned it. "I need to write to my mother," Jedediah said, and the earnestness of it made her laugh against his shoulder. Summer on the ranch was the fullest thing she had yet experienced of it, her first full summer on Kansas land, the grass going gold and the heat pressing down from a white sky, and the cattle moving slowly in the pastures, and the garden producing at a rate that kept her busy with the canning and the putting up and the storing that would carry them through another winter. She was large with the child by August, and she moved more slowly, but she did not stop, because stopping was not in her nature. And Jedediah watched her with a care that was so consistent and unobtrusive that she only noticed it by its effects: the water he carried without being asked, the heavy lifting that disappeared before she reached it, the evening when he sat beside her on the porch and rubbed her feet without ceremony or commentary, just did it, as though it were a natural thing to do. The Harwick brothers had not come back since February, and in July Sheriff Lawson rode out to tell them that Cole Harwick had been arrested in Wichita in connection with a fraudulent land deal in Sumner County. The charges were serious enough that whatever plans the brothers had for the Yates property had almost certainly been suspended indefinitely. Lawson said it with the satisfaction of a lawman who has been watching a particular trouble for a long time and has finally seen it come to account. "Good riddance," Jedediah said. "Indeed," said Lawson, and accepted a cup of coffee from Maude and stayed for an hour talking about the summer and the cattle market and the plans for a new school in Caldwell that several of the town's families had been organizing. After Lawson left, Maude said, "We should support the school." "We should," Jedediah agreed. "Especially now," she said. He looked at her with that particular warmth and said, "Especially now." Their son was born on the 10th of September, 1874, almost exactly 1 year from the day Maude had walked up the path to the Yates ranch house with her carpetbag and her dust-covered boots. The birth was attended by the midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Ruth Hayden, who had delivered half the children in the county, and who handled the whole affair with a brisk competence that Maude was deeply grateful for. The labor was long but not complicated, and Jedediah sat on the other side of the kitchen door and refused to go further than the porch all night, despite Ruth Hayden's suggestions that he might want to sleep, until the morning came and there was the sound he had been waiting for, a strong, indignant cry, and Maude's voice, spent and triumphant, calling to him through the door. Ruth let him in, and he stood at the bedside and looked at his wife, who was exhausted in the particular luminous way of women who have just done something enormous, and at the wrapped bundle in her arms, and his face did something that she had not seen it do before, something entirely new, something so open that she thought she was seeing all the way to the center of him. "A boy," she said, though he could see that. "A boy," he repeated, in a tone of a man confirming something he cannot quite believe. "I thought Thomas," she said, carefully watching his face. "Thomas Jedediah Yates, if you are willing." He looked at her for a moment with those eyes, and there was nothing in them that was anything other than honest. "I think that is exactly right," he said. She had been a little afraid in the quiet dark of some nights that naming the boy for her first husband might be a complicated thing, that Jedediah might feel what some men would feel, a jealousy of the dead, a resistance to the past. But she had known for months now, that Jedediah was not that kind of man. He had loved his wife, and he did not pretend she had not existed, and he understood that love does not diminish the one who was before, and is not diminished by the one who comes after, and that understanding was one of the things she loved most about him. He sat on the edge of the bed and held his son for the first time. This small Thomas Jedediah Yates with his dark hair and his father's jaw and his mother's implacable expression. And Maude watched them together and felt the fullness of it settle around her like the weight of something very good. Autumn came, and the child grew, and the ranch went on in its rhythms. Thomas was a solid, watchful baby who cried with purpose and slept well once he had been thoroughly convinced of the necessity, and who responded to his father's voice from the very beginning with an attention that suggested he already understood that this was a person worth listening to. Jedediah took to fatherhood with the same steady deliberateness he brought to everything, learning it the way he had learned the land, by doing it day after day with full attention. Clara Thorne came to visit when Thomas was 3 weeks old and held him for an hour while Maude ate a full hot meal in peace for the first time since the birth, and Jedediah fixed the hinge on the back door that had been needing attention. And Clara said over Thomas's small head that she was very pleased with how things had turned out, and that she had known from the very first day she met Maude that this was how it was going to go. "Did you?" Maude said. "I told Elias that evening," Clara said, entirely unabashed. "I said that woman is going to be the making of Jedediah Yates, and I was right. I think we have been rather the making of each other," Maude said. "That is the best kind," Clara said, and smiled with the satisfaction of a woman whose hobby has produced excellent results. The second Christmas at the ranch was everything the first one had been and more. Jedediah had made a small wooden cradle for Thomas that he had built in the barn over several weeks, appearing from it in the evenings with sawdust on his shirt and a satisfied quietness about him. And the cradle had carved decorations along the sides that she had not known he was capable of until she saw them. Simple leaves and a small running horse, done with a care and skill that surprised her deeply. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, running her finger along the carved horse. "My father taught me," he said. "He used to say that anything worth making was worth making well." She looked at the cradle for a long moment and thought about the kind of man who made a cradle for his child by hand with carved horses along the sides, and she thought that she was very glad that she had run out of ranches to be turned away from before she got to this one. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," she said. "He was," Jedediah said. "I think you would have liked each other." She put her hand on his arm and he covered it with his own, and Thomas made a sound from his place by the fire that was either contentment or commentary. And the three of them were in the house they were making together, on the land they were keeping together, in the life that had arrived out of the wreckage of two separate losses and become something neither of them could have predicted, but both of them were grateful for. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was milder than the previous one, or perhaps it only seemed so because they were going through it together in a way that was different from that first winter, a settled togetherness that had weight and warmth in it. They still broke ice from the water troughs and still worked through the cold with the particular exhaustion of that work, but they came in from it in the evenings to the lamp and the fire and Thomas in the cradle, and the exhaustion had a different quality when there was this to come back to. Maude had written to her brother in Missouri in October, a letter telling him about the marriage and the baby and the ranch. A long letter, the longest she had written in years, because she had things to say now that were worth saying. He had written back promptly, a letter full of genuine warmth and some relief, she thought, that his sister had found her footing, and he sent his wife's recipe for persimmon pudding as a gift, which Maude made for Christmas and which turned out beautifully. In the spring of 1875, she and Jedediah had their first long conversation about the future of the ranch, a serious conversation about what they wanted to build, how many cattle they could sustain on the land, whether to expand the south pasture by acquiring the adjacent parcel that had come available when old Mr. Fitch had moved his family north, how to manage the water rights along the creek responsibly, and what they wanted to be building toward in 10 years. It was the kind of conversation that is only possible between two people who have genuinely committed to the same future and are not posturing around it. And Maude found that she had real opinions about the ranch by this point, opinions based on months of careful observation. And Jedediah listened to them with the full attention he gave to everything she said, and they argued about some of it in the productive way that good partners argue, testing ideas against each other and arriving at something better than either had started with. They decided to make an offer on the Fitch parcel. The offer was accepted in May, and the additional 20 acres, which included a section of the creek and a stand of timber, became part of the Yates ranch on the 1st of June, 1875. That summer she taught herself to ride Delilah properly, going out in the early evenings when the heat was easing and practicing the things Jedediah showed her: how to sit, how to use the reins with lightness, how to ask the horse for more or less without forcing it. Delilah was exactly as patient as he had promised, a horse of generous disposition who seemed to understand that she was learning and adjusted herself accordingly. By August, Maude could ride the property alone with confidence, and she took to going out on Delilah in the late afternoons, riding the fence lines and the creek bank and the new pasture, knowing the land from the back of a horse the way she was learning to know it from her own feet. One afternoon late in August, she rode to the top of the low rise at the western end of the new pasture, the one that looked back over the whole of the ranch, the house and the barn and the kitchen garden and the cattle in the south pasture, and the late afternoon light was doing its particular performance of gold and rose, and she sat on Delilah and looked at it all and thought about that September morning almost 2 years ago, the dust on her boots, the coin purse with $11.40, the Bible with her parents' names in the front, the 5 closed doors. She thought about Thomas Harper, who had been a good and gentle man and who had loved her honestly, and she was glad for the years she had had with him and sorry still for the way they had ended and grateful that the grief had not made her into someone who could not receive the good thing when it came. She thought about Jedediah waiting in the house below or in the barn or out with the cattle, going about the constant work of the land, that steady man who had said, simply and without knowing what it would mean, that she could stay as long as she needed and had meant it entirely. She turned Delilah back toward home. By the fall of 1875, the ranch had found its full stride. The expansion of the herd had worked well, the additional cattle from the new pasture keeping well and selling at a fair price in Caldwell, and the monthly trip to town becoming a regular pleasant outing that Maude had come to look forward to as an opportunity to see Clara and keep up with the news and bring Thomas, now a walking, opinionated small person with his father's steadiness and his mother's direct gaze, into contact with the world beyond the fence line. Thomas had begun to speak in the autumn, first single words with great authority, then short sentences delivered with the same serious consideration that characterized his father. He called the horse Delilah Lily, and nothing could convince him otherwise, and eventually everyone simply agreed, because some arguments are not worth having, and because Lily suited the bay mare perfectly well. Jedediah's mother, Harriet Yates, came to visit in October of that year, making the journey from Warrensburg, Missouri, on the train to Wichita and from Wichita by stage to Caldwell, arriving at the ranch in a state of determined cheerfulness that had clearly been fueled in part by the sheer adventure of the journey, and in part by the fact that she was about to meet her daughter-in-law and grandchild for the first time. Harriet was 60 and sharp and short and round, and full of the kind of energy that has decided not to slow down regardless of the calendar. She was nothing physically like her son and everything temperamentally like him, the same directness, the same care, the same quality of attention, only louder and more expansive in its expression. She walked into the ranch house, looked around at all of it, looked at Maude, looked at Thomas, and said, "Well, you have done beautifully," and pulled Maude into a hug that left no ambiguity about its warmth. "It is very good to meet you, Mrs. Yates," Maude said. "Harriet," the older woman said, "you are my daughter. Mrs. Yates is entirely too formal." She stayed for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks she taught Maude 4 recipes from her own mother that had never been written down, mended 6 items of clothing from the basket by the fireplace in the particular way of a woman who had been mending for 40 years, and had strong opinions about it, read to Thomas every evening until he fell asleep on her lap, and told Maude, one afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen making a pot of stew, the story of Jedediah's wife Margaret, who had been 28 when she died and who had been, Harriet said, a fine woman, warm and clever, who had been very good for Jedediah and whom he had loved very much and whose loss had taken something from him for a long time. He was not himself for more than 2 years, Harriet said, stirring the stew. He kept the ranch going, but there was a hollowness. You could see it if you knew him well enough. I worried. She paused and looked at Maude with eyes that were Jedediah's eyes, the same dark color, the same quality of directness. He is himself again. More, maybe. You have been very good for him. He has been very good for me, Maude said. Good, said Harriet, in exactly the same tone that her son used that word, and Maude laughed, and Harriet looked at her with a sudden delighted recognition and said, He does that too, does he? Constantly, Maude said. Harriet laughed with her, and the kitchen was full of the sound of it, warm against the October cold outside. When Harriet left, the ranch settled into the deep quiet of late autumn with a feeling of additional richness, as though something that had been slightly incomplete had been filled in. Jedediah was lighter for having had his mother there, and for watching his mother and his wife together. And in the evenings he would sometimes reach across the table and take her hand for no particular reason, just to hold it for a moment. And she had learned to understand that this was his way of saying things that he could have put into words, but found more fully expressed in that simple gesture. The winter of 1875 was quiet and good, and in the spring of 1876 Maude told him that she was expecting again. He reacted with the same warmth as before and none of the anxiety, which was the sign of a man who had done it once and knew that he could do it again, and they talked about the baby easily, and with the happiness that comes from knowing what this kind of waiting leads to. This time the birth was faster than the first. Ruth Hayden arrived with less urgency and left sooner, satisfied that everything was going well, and the child that arrived on a warm June morning was a girl, compact and determined, with a red face and an extremely loud opinion about her arrival, and Maude held her and thought that here was the other side of the world, a girl in this big prairie country, a girl who was going to need to know things. "Abilene," she said, when Jedediah had been let in and he sat on the bed beside her and looked at the small, furious face of his daughter. "Abilene," he agreed. "Abilene Harriet Yates. Your mother will be very pleased about the middle name." "She will," he said. "She will also come immediately and stay for a month." "I will write to her today," Maude said. He laughed, which was the particular laugh she had been hearing more of in the 2.5 years since that first day, a laugh that was unhurried and genuine, and she thought she would never be entirely accustomed to how good it sounded. Thomas, who was 20 months old and had been supervised by Clara Thorne for the duration, was brought home that afternoon and introduced to his sister with the solemnity appropriate to the occasion. He looked at Abilene for a long time with his father's assessment expression, and then looked at Maude and said, with total seriousness, "Small." "She will get bigger," Maude told him. He appeared to consider this reasonable and reached out one careful finger and touched Aline's hand, and Abilene gripped it with the reflexive grip of the newborn. And Thomas looked down at that tiny grip on his finger, and something moved across his face that was too complex for his 20 months but entirely real. And Maude thought that here was the beginning of a friendship that would last them both a lifetime. Autumn found the ranch at its fullest. The garden had produced abundantly enough that the root cellar and the pantry were stocked for winter, and there were jars and jars of canned tomatoes and pickled vegetables and preserved fruit lined up on the kitchen shelves like a small and edible economy. The cattle herd was healthy, and the dairy cows were producing well, and the henhouse had been expanded in the summer, and was now home to 12 hens, who provided more eggs than the family needed, and gave Maude a small but satisfying surplus to trade in Caldwell. The ranch itself had become known in the county for being a well-run place, the kind where the fences were kept tight and the stock was well cared for, and the people who worked there were treated fairly. Jedediah had taken on 2 cowhands for the heavy season, a young man named Augusto Reyes from Texas who was quiet and exceptionally good with the cattle, and an older man, Roy Bledsoe, who had worked ranches across 3 states and who was blunt and funny, and took his coffee strong, and had a gift for the horses that was almost supernatural. Maude fed them all and ran the household and the dairy and the garden and the accounts, because she had a head for numbers that she had not previously been called upon to use, but discovered she had once she picked up the ledger that Jedediah had been keeping in his own approximate way, and she brought it to a clarity and order that made him look at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the thing he needed most had been sitting at his own kitchen table. "You did not tell me you could do accounts," he said. "You did not ask," she said. "What else can you do that you have not yet told me?" he said with a small curl at the corner of his mouth. She considered. "I play the piano tolerably, though we do not have one." "We do not have one," he agreed. Yet she looked at him. He looked back with perfect innocence, which on Jedediah Yates was funnier than it sounds because he was not by nature an innocent-looking man. "Jedediah," she said, "yes, do not buy me a piano. I have already written to a man in Wichita," he said. She stared at him. "When?" "In August," he said, "when you told me about the piano." "That was a hypothetical," she said. "Was it?" he said. The piano arrived in November, on a wagon from Wichita, requiring 4 men to get it into the main room, where it sat against the north wall and immediately changed the character of the room entirely, turned it from a working man's parlor into something that had music in it. Maude sat down at it that first evening and played haltingly, her fingers finding their way back to what they had known as a girl, and Jedediah sat in the chair by the fire with Abilene on his lap and Thomas at his feet, and listened with a quality of attentiveness that made her self-consciousness about the rustiness of her playing fade, because you do not perform badly for someone who is listening to you that way. You only play honestly. She played Jeannie with the light brown hair and beautiful dreamer, and a hymn from her childhood that she could not remember the name of but knew every note, and when she finished the room was very quiet for a moment, and then Thomas said, with great decisiveness, "More," and Abilene made a sound of agreement, and Jedediah said nothing but looked at her with those cream-colored eyes in the firelight, and the look was worth more than any words he might have found. By the time the autumn of 1877 arrived, Maude Harper Yates had been on the Kansas prairie for 4 years. The girl who had walked up the path with the carpetbag and the dust on her boots was not gone. She recognized herself in certain moments, in the way she still braced for bad news, in the way she still held her chin level when she was uncertain, but she had been added to considerably. She was a rancher's wife and a mother and a bookkeeper and a dairywoman and a pianist and a gardener and a neighbor and a friend, and she was all of these things on her own terms, the terms she had negotiated with the world on that September morning when she had walked through the 5th door. She and Jedediah had developed, over 4 years, a private vocabulary of gestures and glances, and the particular shorthand of people who have spent enough time together that communication becomes more efficient and more complete simultaneously. She knew what his silences meant, and he knew what hers meant, and they had argued and reconciled and laughed and worked and been afraid together and been glad together. And the sum of all of it was something she could not easily name but felt in her body as a kind of rightness, the rightness of being in the place where you are supposed to be. One evening in late October of 1877, the last evening of a run of warm days that felt like the prairie's final generous gesture before turning its face to winter, they sat together on the porch after supper with the children in bed, and the stars beginning to appear over the dark line of the western hills. She had her mother's Bible in her lap, open to the page with her parents' names, and beside that, in her own handwriting, she had written the names of her family, Thomas Harper, and then below, Maude Harper Yates, and below that Jedediah Yates, and below that Thomas Jedediah Yates and Abilene Harriet Yates, and there was still space on the page. Jedediah was sitting beside her with his coffee, looking at the stars in the way he sometimes did in the evenings, with a quiet and unperforming appreciation. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said, without looking away from the stars. "About how things arrive," she said. "How you cannot know when you are walking away from the fourth closed door that the fifth door is going to be different. You just walk toward it anyway because there is nowhere else to walk." He turned and looked at her. "Are you glad that you kept walking?" "Jedediah," she said, "I am the most glad thing there is." He reached over and took her hand, the way he did in the evenings, the gesture that meant everything and needed no translation, and they sat on the porch together in the last warmth of the October evening with the stars coming out overhead, and the sounds of the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds, the horses in the barn and the creek in the south pasture and the dry grass in the wind, and the lamp in the window behind them making a warm yellow square against the dark. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he pressed his cheek briefly to the top of her head, and they were there together in that, the two of them on the land they had decided to keep, in the life they had built from the material of loss and chance, and a man who had meant it when he said she could stay as long as she needed. The stars were very bright. The prairie was very wide. The house behind them was warm and full and alive with the breathing of their children, and the October wind was soft, and the whole enormous world was right there around them, and it was enough, and more than enough, and it was home. In the years that followed, the Yates Ranch continued to grow and take on the character of a place that had been loved into its best shape. A third child, a boy they named William, arrived in the spring of 1879, round and loud and enormously pleased with himself from the very beginning, and the ranch house was expanded that same year to accommodate the growing family. Jedediah and Roy Bledsoe and Augusto Ray's working through the spring to add 2 more rooms and a wider porch that ran the full length of the south side of the house. Maude helped design the expansion with the same practicality she brought to everything, insisting on a larger kitchen with better light, a proper pantry with shelves, and a small room off the main room that she intended for the piano, and for Thomas to learn at it, which he did, having apparently inherited something of his mother's ear, if not yet her diligence. The school in Caldwell had been built by 1878, and Thomas began attending in the fall of that year, riding Lily in with a group of neighboring children under the supervision of one of the older boys, and arriving home each afternoon with the particulate energy of a child who has spent a day among many other children and has absorbed all of it and needs to discharge it somewhere. He told them about everything at supper with enormous thoroughness, the lessons and the teacher and the other children and the things that had happened, and Maude and Jedediah listened to all of it with full attention, because they had both decided early that their children's lives would be taken seriously. Abilene, when she began school 2 years later, was a different story entirely, arriving at the classroom on the first day with the confidence of someone who has surveyed the situation and decided it is manageable, which her teacher later reported to Maude with something between admiration and mild apprehension, because Abilene had taken it upon herself, in the first week, to reorganize the corner where the younger children kept their things to a more logical arrangement. And the teacher had not been entirely sure whether to be grateful or to establish a boundary. "She comes by it honestly," Jedediah said, when Maude reported this. "I do not know what you mean," Maude said, with the particular composure of a woman who knows exactly what is meant. William was neither Thomas nor Abilene, but entirely himself, a cheerful philosophical child who was interested in animals above all other things, and who could be found, at almost any given moment, in conversation with the ranch's various livestock about matters apparently of mutual concern. He had Maude's dark hair and Jedediah's jaw, and the temperament of someone who had come into the world certain of his own welcome, and he was very good at being the youngest. By 1880, the Yates Ranch was one of the better-known operations in the county, not the largest, but respected for its consistent quality and for the character of its owners. Jedediah had been asked twice to stand for county commissioner and had twice declined, not from disinterest in the community, but because the ranch and his family took all of him, and he was not willing to shortchange either. He contributed in the ways he could, helping neighbors in the hard times, serving on the board of the new school, giving generously when the church took up collections for families in need. Maude had by this point become a fixture of the Caldwell community in her own right, someone the women of the town came to for advice on dairy and garden, and on the practical management of a hard country life, someone whose opinions were listened to and whose judgment was respected, someone who had no pretension about herself, but an absolute clarity about what she thought and why she thought it, which people found, once they were accustomed to it, to be a genuinely useful quality in a neighbor. She had been turned away at 5 ranches, and she never forgot it, not as a wound but as a fact, the way you keep a fact that explains something important about how the world works and about the value of the one person who chose differently. She had carried Thomas Harper in the pocket of her ribs and learned to carry him lightly, with love and without weight, the way the dead are best carried by those who loved them, close but not burdensome, present but not captive. She had arrived at Jedediah Yates' gate with dust on her boots and a carpetbag, and $11.40, and the belief, worn thin by that point but not yet gone, that honest work deserved an honest chance. And he had given it to her, not as charity, not as anything requiring gratitude in excess, but as a simple human recognition, and from that recognition everything else had followed. On an evening in September of 1880, 7 years from the morning she had first walked up the path to the ranch house, she stood at the kitchen window and watched Jedediah come in from the south pasture with Thomas at his side, the boy nearly as tall as his father now, the two of them walking with the same easy stride over the dry September grass. Abilene was at the table behind her doing her school lessons with a focused ferocity. William was somewhere in the barn with the horses, as usual. The smell of supper was on the air, and the last of the evening light was turning the western hills that familiar rose gold. She watched the man and the boy come across the yard, and she felt the full weight of the life she was living, all of it, the loss that had preceded it, and the chance that had made it, and the 7 years of daily work and love and argument and laughter and grief and joy that had shaped it into this particular thing, this ranch, this family, this evening. Jedediah looked up from across the yard and saw her in the window and raised one hand, a small gesture, the gesture of a man acknowledging his home and the person in it, and she raised hers in return, and the distance between them was just a yard's width of evening light, and it was nothing, and it was everything, and it was the simple, irreplaceable fact of 2 people who had chosen each other in a hard country, and had kept on choosing every day, through all the days that the world had given them. She went to the stove and stirred the supper and called through the kitchen door to Abilene that her father was coming, and Abilene called back that she had heard, and William appeared in the doorway from the barn side with hay in his hair and the enormous contentment of a small boy who has spent a satisfying hour with animals, and she looked at him and shook her head and said, "William Yates, look at the state of you," and he grinned at her with Jedediah's grin, and she felt it again. The fullness, the rightness, the home. The door opened and Jedediah and Thomas came in, and the kitchen filled with the sound and warmth of them, and the supper was ready, and the lamp was burning, and outside the October evening was settling softly down over the Kansas prairie, over the cattle in the south pasture, and the creek running clear along the fence line, and the kitchen garden in its autumn quiet and the horses in the barn, over all the things they had built and kept and loved, over all the wide and beautiful and demanding country that had been strange to her once and was hers now, deeply and completely hers. Jedediah pulled off his hat and hung it on the hook and caught her eye across the kitchen and smiled. That smile she had been seeing for 7 years and had never once tired of. And she smiled back. And there was nothing left unfinished between them. Nothing unresolved. Nothing that had not been named and held and placed in its right position in the life they had made. She set the food on the table and they sat down together, all 5 of them, in the lamplight, in the good warm house on the good-kept land. And outside the stars were beginning to come out over the prairie one by one, and everything was exactly as it should be.